Hello, and welcome to this edition of Faculty Forum Online. This is a program sponsored by the MIT Alumni Association that gives viewers the chance to get a glimpse of some of the innovative research being done at MIT and to ask questions of our guests. If you would like to ask a question, go to the screen, the box on your screen, that is, and fill in your first name or a username if you prefer, and your geographic location along with your question. Given the high volume of viewers, we will not be able to answer all of the questions. However, we'll do the best we can to get to as many as is reasonable. I am Lou Alexander, the Director of Alumni Education for the MIT Alumni Association, and will act as moderator. In today's program, we will be looking at the topic of climate change research and the need for a new direction. Addressing this will be Kerry Emanuel, the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Atmospheric Science, as well as the co-founder of the Lorenz Center at MIT. I might also point out Kerry is an alumnus who holds both a undergraduate and a PhD degree. He, for those of you who know Kerry, probably will know him most for the in-depth analyses he has done with hurricanes. In 2006, Time magazine recognized this research by including him in its list of 100 most influential people in the world. However, Kerry's research into hurricanes extends well beyond the storms themselves, and that has become a platform really for studying larger issues around climate change. And that is the focus today for his remarks, and the need for a new direction. So, to get us started, let me just turn to Kerry and have him give us a sense of the scope of this research, why a new direction is needed, and what it might look like. Kerry, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Lou. It's really nice to be with you and everyone here today. I wanted to just set the stage for your questions by giving a very quick overview of the field, ending with why I think, and many of my colleagues think, we need a new direction in it. The first point I'd like to make is that climate science is not a new science. By the middle of the 19th century, some of the great mathematicians and scientists of that era, people like Jean-Baptiste Fourier, John Tyndall, understood very well that the surface temperature of the Earth was much warmer than it would have been otherwise, thanks to the presence of gases that exist in trace quantities in our atmosphere, gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And already by the end of the 19th century, Swedish chemist Svan Arrhenius published a paper where he noted that the combustion of fossil fuels, which was really just getting underway at that time, would inevitably increase the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. And he actually made some calculations based upon, among other things, his measurements of moonlight that suggested that doubling carbon dioxide would raise the surface temperature of the Earth by 8 or 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, one fact that we have understood for 100 years is that if we took away the greenhouse gases, the Earth's mean surface temperature, mean annual surface temperature, would plummet from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. If you just took away carbon dioxide all by itself, you go from 60 degrees to 42 degrees. So it stands to reason that if you double carbon dioxide, you're going to see a big change in temperature. None of this is controversial, or has been controversial until recently in science, but that's the way it goes. Now, why should we be concerned about this? There are some reasons that warming the planet would be a good thing. Svan Arrhenius was a Swede. He thought warming wasn't such a bad idea. He said he thought it would take us 1,000 years because he couldn't see the acceleration of this industrial revolution. But there are some things to be seriously concerned about. So let's think about climate on all sorts of timescales. Climate does change naturally. It changes for a variety of reasons, including changes of the Earth's orbital parameters, tilt of its axis and so forth, the ellipticity of its orbit about the sun. Volcanoes change the climate, and naturally changing carbon dioxide content also changes the climate. So if we turn the clock back 22,000 years, which is the blink of an eye geologically, when the orbital characteristics of the Earth were a little bit different, which changed the distribution of sunlight. The Earth's surface temperature was at about 8 degrees or 9 degrees Fahrenheit lower than today. And sea level was 400 feet lower than today. Okay, this is pretty big, right? You could, if you could get out from under the ice sheet here in Boston, you could walk to Provincetown, right? That's how low sea level was. So we're projecting, the science is projecting that the temperature will go up by 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And the last time the planet was that warm was about 3 million years ago during a period called the Pliocene, when the sea level was about 100 feet higher than today's. All right? 100 feet was the last time it was that warm, was 100 feet. Now, climate science is predicting, on the other hand, that sea level by the end of the century should go up by 3 or 4 feet. That's a very conservative estimate. There's a good reason for that, because it takes ice, Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, a long time to melt, fortunately for us. So unless of course, we have to be prepared for surprises. I just want to emphasize that the forecast of 3 feet of sea level rise is a conservative estimate. If it did go up 100 feet, you'd lose a lot of the major cities of the world. You know, I was just watching just to emphasize again the point that this isn't new. Back in 1958, Bell Telephone Company, remember Ma Bell? Sponsored a TV program called Science Hour. Can you believe that people would watch science for a whole hour back in those days? And I watched one clip that was devoted to climate science in 1958. It was really interesting because it was all that sort of the style of the 1950s. And they were basically saying pretty much what we're saying today, that we were at great risk of changing the climate, sea level will go up. They had a great cartoon showing tourists in glass-bottomed boats peering down at the city of Miami. This is 1958. Excellent. Isn't that amazing? The other thing that we're concerned about beyond sea level is other things that have to do with the climate. And one thing that we're quite sure of, that you don't need huge computer models to show, is that rainfall and snow get concentrated in fewer but more extreme events. So ironically, the incidence of drought and flash floods go up as you warm the climate. And we're beginning to see that in climate statistics. Now, what people may not know is that our own Defense Department here in the U.S. is very concerned about this, and they've been devoting a lot of effort to understanding and dealing with climate change, and they view it as a very high up on their list of national security threats. Why? Because they understand that this changing patterns of rainfall greatly affect the supply of food and water, and that historically food shortages have been major catalyzers of political upheaval. Well, the French Revolution, which had deep political roots, but the proximate cause of it was a pair of hailstorms that went across France the summer before the revolution and ruined the wheat crop, all right? And the proximate cause of the Arab Spring was chronic food shortages there. Now, you talk about the Middle East. It's already marginal for growing food. You wreck that. You have a lot of potential for political instability. So if our own Defense Department takes it seriously, maybe we should. Yes. So there are all kinds of reasons to be concerned. I work on storms and hurricanes, and we're pretty much to the conclusion that the incidence of the destructive high-category hurricanes ought to increase when you increase the temperature of the planet. We see signals like that in the data, and that's another thing to be concerned about. We can't attribute single events to climate change, but events like Sandy are forecast to become more common, and that's another reason to be concerned about that. So I think the main point is that dumping CO2 in the atmosphere incurs risk for our children and their children. There's just no doubt about it. How much risk? Well, it's the nature of the game of risk. You don't know exactly, right? But an analogy is, you know, as recently as the 18th and even early 19th century, people in major cities in the West were dumping their chamber pots into the street at the end of the day, all right? And that caused a lot of problems with disease, and wasn't a very pleasant place to live. And people started contemplating freshwater distribution systems and sewers and that sort of thing. And we're told it's much too expensive, you can't do it. Well, we did do it, right? We did it anyway, and we saved a lot of trouble, and life is much nicer because we have those things. There's sort of an analogy there. We're being told again by people whose interests are the status quo that we can't do it. Well, of course we can do it. Yes. Now, let me sort of wrap this up by saying that in my field, we have a problem which indicates to us that we really do need to take a new direction. And the problem is that this global warming situation is so critical and so vital for us that we focus nearly all of our resources in climate to solving this. And along the way, we've started to scale back doing basic research on climate. And I think if this continues in the long term, we're in trouble, because a really great young scientist who's applying to MIT or elsewhere, he looks at this field and says, oh, it's all about global warming and running these huge black box computers. That's not for me. That doesn't sound very interesting. And so we aren't getting the flow of talent into this field that we need to solve the problem. We put too much faith in huge computer models and too much effort in solving the supply problem, and we've let basic research kind of dry up a bit. So to counter that, here at MIT, as you mentioned in your introduction, my colleague Dan Rothman and I started a new center called the Lorenz Center, which is a climate think tank. It doesn't participate in IPCC, which is a great process for what it's doing, but we're not doing that. It's all basic science, curiosity-driven science, 24/7. And we hope to use that to get back to fundamentals to attract a new pool of talent into the field. It's happening right here at MIT, and it's something that our alumni support. Almost all of what we're doing is supported right at this moment by our own alumni. Yes. So we're very proud of that, and look forward to keeping it going.
Yes. Well, excellent. That gives us a lot to think about. In fact, as the questions start to come in, I'm going to take this opportunity to simply pick up on you're touching on carbon dioxide. And I wonder if you can give us a sense of how great a reduction do we have to have in carbon dioxide, and about how long a time frame before we see some significant improvements here?
Excellent question. We're putting in all kinds of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the most important influence that we're having, but we're also putting methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons. But carbon dioxide's special. It's a special cause for worry, because its lifetime in the atmosphere is very long. It takes literally thousands of years to get rid of it. So if we were to stop putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today, the level that we've already ramped it up to, we started at 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. We're up to about 400 today. We're stuck with that 400. Okay, even if we went cold turkey today, that 400 will be around for many, many, many generations. Yeah. And the temperature effects that go along with it are around for many generations. Right. So that's why we don't, unfortunately, have the luxury of waiting. Yes. It's not as though we quit doing it and everything just goes back to normal.
Well, as predicted, the questions are starting to flood in. We are dealing with an MIT audience, after all. So one from New Jersey: how far can you predict into the future concerning climate change?
Well, when we talk about it, we use the term projection rather than prediction. Prediction to us means a specific prediction, like tomorrow's weather, for example. So projections have a human element, because not only do we have to predict how the climate system will respond, we have to predict how the human system will go in the future. As we have to actually make a guess at how much more carbon we're going to put into the atmosphere. Your guess is as good as mine. So we have these scenarios. And once you are given an emission scenario, you try to make a prediction of how the climate. Now, if you talk to my colleagues, or if you were to ask me, there's no question that there's uncertainty in these predictions. The climate models are not great. They're the best tool we have. When we say that the climate will warm 3 degrees centigrade, about 5 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century, it's sort of our best estimate. It could be smaller than that. It could be as small as 2 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe at the very smallest. It could be larger than that. It could be 8 degrees. There's uncertainty in this, and it's the best we can do. That's the nature of the game. It's risk involved. We hope that it doesn't turn out to be on the high side of that scenario, but you've got to go with the best information that you have.
Yes. This is actually a very good question from Petter in Oslo. He says, could you recommend 2 to 3 books for a scientifically literate amateur to get up to speed with climate science?
Well, at the risk of tooting my own horn, I just wrote such a book. It's exactly aimed for that.
I was just going to say, it is excellent. I am totally an amateur and can attest to it. And we can certainly send this to you on a link that we're going to send tomorrow to everyone who register. We can send some information about this.
So the book is called What We Know About Climate Change, and because it's called What We Know, it's a slim volume. You can read it in one sitting. If it was What We Didn't Know, it would be an encyclopedia. But it is directed toward an audience of people like yourself who are educated but not experts in this field, just to give a summary of where we stand. Besides that book, it's worth reading at least the summary sections of the last report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which was issued in 2007. Later this year, I believe, they'll come up with a next edition. That is all completely free online, but it's a lot more material to wade through.
Yes. Excuse me. You had touched on some issues of basic scientific research in your remarks, and I think these are crucial across the board for a lot of trends we're seeing here. And Tony in Brussels asks a question, what are the big issues for basic research on climate science?
Oh, there's absolutely fascinating issues. One of the most basic ones, I mean, we could spend hours talking about this, but one of the most basic issues is for a given forcing of the system, and by forcing we mean the amount of sunlight coming in, the composition of our atmosphere, that sort of thing. Is there only one statistically stable equilibrium state of the climate, or are there multiple equilibria? That is, if you somehow made it cold, would it, without changing the sunlight or the carbon dioxide and so forth, would it stay cold or made it warm? We all believe that if you somehow got to a state where the Earth was completely covered by ice, and we think it might have been about 500 million years ago or so, it's very hard to get out of that state because all that ice reflects sunlight, and so it stays cold. There is modeling done by my colleague here at MIT, John Marshall, that suggests that the planet may have as many as 3 or even 4 stable equilibrium states for a given forcing. That's important because if you have this kind of system and you start slowly changing the forcing, at some point the system may jump to one of these new equilibrium states, and we had better understand that. I think it's interesting in its own right, but we better understand that if we're going to understand how the planet responds to changing forcing.
Yes. Well, you know, we have a question from Kevin here in Natick, and it has to do with the ability of the oceans to absorb carbon dioxide. And he's wondering, is there a, I guess he's saying it's a stasis. In other words, if we produce more, will the oceans absorb more or less? Or is there a balance there, or have we reached a saturation point or a tipping point? Or?
Well, that's an excellent question. In fact, of the amount of carbon that we have put into the atmosphere since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, only about half of it has stayed in the atmosphere. About a quarter of it goes into the terrestrial biosphere, plants, trees. And another quarter of it goes into the ocean. It mostly gets dissolved into the ocean, and this is actually a big problem in itself because it's decreasing the pH of ocean water, increasing its acidity, and this is beginning to seriously affect some microorganisms that live in the ocean. But this buffering, according to, and I'm not a geochemist, but according to geochemists here at MIT and others I talked to, that buffering effect is thought to decline as you add more and more carbon dioxide to the ocean, or its ability to take it up actually gets less rather than more, unfortunately.
Right. From New York, Neil asks, although the changing climate is unquestionable, there is still much debate on whether these changes are man-made. Is there any credibility to those who doubt that climate change is man-made? It seems to be
in short, not any longer. I mean, I think 20 years ago, I was among those who said, show me the data, show me the evidence. And there's been so much more evidence now than there was 20 years ago. First of all, we've had 20 more years, but even more importantly, we've just, people working all around the world have quantified how the climate is changing so much better than 20 years ago that I don't know any climate scientists, including those who would tell you they're skeptical, that doubt that we are changing the climate. I think the arguments in the profession, as opposed to in the blogosphere and so forth, are all about how much more change will there be and what are the real risks associated with that change.
Well, here is a question from Bob in Miami, and we're coming back to carbon dioxide, not surprisingly. And he's wondering if there are technologies for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to reverse the effect instead of waiting for nature to remove it from the atmosphere.
That's an excellent question, and the answer is, in short, yes. Those technologies exist. The entire and they're being seriously discussed. The entire trick is to get their application down to the point where it's economical, it makes economic sense to do it. So one technology which is very underdeveloped at this stage is called clean air capture, where you, instead of removing it from the source, you remove it basically anywhere. For example, you can remove it next to the place where you want to ultimately sequester it in the earth and just take it out that way. And what's really remarkable about this to me, and I'm not someone intimately involved in this kind of effort, is how little capital there is going into it. The venture capitalists don't want to do it because the return is much too far away in time. And I would have thought that the fossil fuel industry would fund this kind of research because it would actually make the continued combustion of fossil fuels somewhat more viable if we can take the carbon back out of the atmosphere. But I don't see a lot of that happening.
Actually, here's a question that might be a follow-on, actually, from Patrick in Albany. In what areas do we have sufficient information to guide policy decisions?
Well, it depends on the problem with the question. It's an excellent question, but the problem is that everybody has a different aversion to risk. And the answer to the question depends on that level of aversion to risk. So naturally, there's some very simple things that one wants to do that not only don't cost anything, but actually might be beneficial. That's sort of a low-hanging fruit that everybody can agree to. So one thing that people in my profession or people who study energy is the one thing we should stop doing is actively subsidizing fossil fuels. And we do that through tax breaks, but we also do that by refusing to force certain industries like coal to pay for the enormous externalities that they incur. You know, it's estimated that the health, forget about carbon dioxide, the health externalities of coal amount to about $10 billion a year. It's not a principle of the free market system that you get to dump stuff in your neighbor's backyard and make them pay for it, but we're doing that massively. We have to stop doing that, and then we don't have to subsidize solar and so forth. One of the other things that we really ought to be doing is building more nuclear power plants. You know, France went from a carbon economy in 1974 when the first fuel crisis hit to a nuclear energy economy in 1990, 16 years. They went from mostly carbon to 80% nuclear. And nobody's complaining about France. Germany dismantled its nuclear industry recently, but they've made up the difference partially by buying electricity from France that generates it that way. So there are some things, and here, you know, the problem is that one side of the political spectrum, conservatives, are too busy denying that there's a problem to be arguing for change that makes sense, and they're letting the other side dictate, you know, things that may not make such great sense, like putting lots of subsidies into one kind of renewable or another. So the argument needs to get back onto the table. What are we going to do about this, and what makes sense? Yes. And that's where we need to be.
Yes, yes, and that certainly raises a question about the role of technology in developing these new avenues for us. So, Diane in Rochester is wondering, what is climate preparedness, and how can scientists help governments get ready for increased storms and tidal changes?
So this is a very interesting question as well. And what we see happening is that a lot of these sort of preparations, we call it adaptation to climate change, the preparations for what now unfortunately seems inevitable is happening more and more at the local level and not at the national level in the United States. So a lot of cities, towns, I actually work with some of them, are preparing. So even before Sandy, the city of New York was undertaking a big effort to figure out what it should be doing about building seawalls and levees to protect the city from storms like that. Now that Sandy has occurred, they've accelerated those efforts. You see all around the place, people, town governments, city governments, and in some cases states, trying to do things to prepare for climate change. So it seems to be more of a grassroots effort than some national top-down effort.
Yeah. Well, you know, Frank in Honolulu asked a question that I've kind of wondered about myself. And he says, are there any ideas to block sunlight or make changes to the atmosphere, oceans, or land masses that could affect global warming?
So, yes, the answer, that's a great question. Besides the obvious thing of trying to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, which we talked about before, there are such techniques. They fall under the general term geoengineering. Can we engineer our way out of this? And there are all kinds of techniques. For example, it's been proposed that we put a lot of sulfate into the stratosphere, which is something that happens naturally when there are large volcanic eruptions, and that sulfate produces an aerosol that reflects sunlight directly from the stratosphere and cools the planet back down. The great advantage of that is it's cheap. But there are two disadvantages. I mean, it really is. It's so cheap that a small country or even a wealthy individual can undertake it, which is kind of worrying because there's nothing in international law that stops them doing that. But there are two worries we have. The most serious is that we aren't sure what this would do to the ozone layer. And the ozone layer is absolutely necessary for life. We have to be shielded from ultraviolet. There's some concern, and we see it after big volcanic eruptions, that we would deplete the ozone layer too much by doing that. The other concern is that it's not a zero-sum game. If you brought the temperature back down by using sulfates, the global precipitation would be less than it was before we had global warming. And so you're kind of messing with the climate system. And this gets into almost moral and philosophical issues. Do you undertake something to correct something deliberately, but which has a few risks, or do you do nothing and let the system go as it's going now, which incurs risks itself? It's an interesting question.
Well, we're coming down actually to the last couple of questions. As predicted, we are running out of time. We cannot get to all the questions. But Christoph in Germany is wondering, what could be potential ways to overcome the dilemma of the effort and cost to fight global warming needed now versus benefits payoff only noticeable in the future? I mean, this is one of the conundrums, it seems to me, that...
Well, it certainly is a conundrum, and there are not too many examples in history of a generation forking out a lot of money to help 2 or 3 generations or further downstream. We're interested in our own kids, but there aren't too many cases in history where we do things. And it is a conundrum. I don't think there's any way around that. How much do you spend on future generations? And but I think there are things that we can do, and we've talked about a few, and it's not just me who thinks that, but people who spend their lives thinking about it say, I mean, one thing we can do is tax carbon. Now, that tax doesn't have to be in the form of a net tax, increase in tax revenue to the government. You can trade off and reduce taxes elsewhere, but shouldn't we be taxing something that's bad for our children rather than something that's good for us?
Yes. Yes. Well, in closing, this is an absolutely fitting question, since we're dealing with an MIT network of alumni and friends. What can concerned alumni and friends do to help this situation?
Well, that's great, and I could say there are many things I can do. One thing that's very sort of almost unique to MIT alumni at this point is you can help us with the Lorenz Center. Yes, it's self-serving, but I'd like you to know that we really are honestly trying to advance basic science here, and it helps students, it helps the field. But beyond that, it's a matter of helping to mold the government policy at this point, and I don't mean necessarily at the national level or at the local level, to do things that make sense economically and make sense for the climate. Things like whether you want to tax carbon, or if you're in a coastal city, try to adapt a little bit by building levees, but just simply get involved, understand the issue, and act as you should as a citizen in what directions you think are fitting after having learned about the problem.
Terry, thank you. It's always a delight hearing you, and thank you to everyone who has tuned in. We encourage you to continue the discussion by going to the blog Slice of MIT. The address will come up on the screen at the end of this, and we will send it to you tomorrow in a message to everyone who registered. So when you look at it on the screen, it won't be the last time you see it. The next Faculty Forum online will be 1 month from today on March 5th. Until then, goodbye.